Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The content provided in this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, psychological, financial, or professional advice. Divorce law, custody regulations, and mental health protocols vary significantly by state and individual jurisdiction. The documentaries, case studies, and historical trends discussed herein represent specific perspectives and do not encompass the entirety of the human experience or the legal system. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with a qualified legal professional or licensed therapist regarding their specific personal circumstances. In the United States, a man takes his own life every 13 minutes. While that statistic is staggering on its own, a deep dive into the demographic data reveals a much darker, often ignored reality. Divorced men in America are nearly 8 times more likely to commit suicide than divorced women. This is not just a personal tragedy. It is a silent public health crisis that has been simmering beneath the surface of the American suburban dream for decades. Yet, when you turn on your television or browse streaming platforms, the narrative you see is often filtered through a very specific lens. For years, the U.S. media has portrayed the divorced man through a series of tired, often damaging archetypes. The bumbling incompetent who cannot figure out a washing machine, the predatory deadbeat hiding assets in offshore accounts, or the invisible ghost who simply fades into the background of his children's lives. But why does this narrative persist despite a growing body of evidence suggesting a much more complex and often heartbreaking reality? Why is it that in the land of the free, the documentary record of the male divorce experience is so deeply polarized? Today, we are opening a door that many in the media would prefer stayed shut. We are deconstructing the evolution of how U.S. documentaries have portrayed divorced men, from the early days of sensationalist investigative journalism to the modern era of advocacy filmmaking. We are going to look at the psychological mechanics used to shape public perception, the financial incentives that drive certain media narratives, and the historical trends that have led us to this specific cultural moment. The objective of this 10-part masterclass is to provide you with a comprehensive analysis of the intersection between family law, media representation, and the male identity. This is not about picking sides or engaging in the gender wars that dominate social media comment sections. Instead, this is a meticulous examination of the cultural scripts that govern our understanding of what happens when a marriage ends. We will explore the potential outcomes of how these media portrayals influence legislative change, how they impact the mental health of millions of American fathers, and how they shape the expectations of the next generation. By the end of this deep dive, you will have a sophisticated framework for understanding the divorce industry, as portrayed in film, the historical shift from traditional alimony structures to the modern no-fault era, and the way documentary filmmakers use specific visual and narrative techniques to either humanize or demonize their subjects. We are solving the problem of narrative blindness. Today, you will learn to see the strings behind the stories. To understand where we are in 2026, we have to look back at the historical trends that set the stage for our current documentary landscape. For the better part of the late 20th century, the divorce documentary was almost non-existent as a standalone genre. Instead, the male experience of divorce was largely relegated to the social problem segment of evening news programs like 60 Minutes or 2020. In these early iterations, the divorced man was almost exclusively framed within the context of the deadbeat dad epidemic. These programs focused heavily on the failure of child support systems and the perceived abandonment of the nuclear family. Case studies from this era were often selected for their shock value: men who fled across state lines to avoid financial obligations. While these cases certainly existed, the singular focus on this archetype created a massive vacuum in the cultural conversation. It ignored the men who were fighting for joint custody at a time when that concept was legally and socially revolutionary. It ignored the psychological impact of the tender years doctrine, a legal principle that historically presumed mothers were the best caregivers for young children, effectively sidelining fathers in the documentary narrative before they even had a chance to speak. As we moved into the 2000s, a new wave of filmmaking began to emerge, driven by the democratization of digital video and a growing frustration with the family court system. This shift saw the rise of the investigative exposé, where the divorced man was repositioned not as the villain, but as a victim of a systemic machine. A seminal example of this can be found in the 2014 documentary Divorce Corp, directed by Joseph Sorg. This film represented a massive pivot in the U.S. documentary landscape. It moved away from the emotional domestic drama and instead focused on the cold, hard mathematics of the U.S. family law system, an industry it valued at over $50 billion a year. Through a series of high-stakes case studies, the documentary portrayed divorced men as profit centers for a network of lawyers, judges, and court-appointed experts. The film meticulously detailed how the adversarial system of American law incentivizes conflict. If a man and woman can agree on terms, the lawyers make thousands. If they fight for a decade, the lawyers make millions. This documentary was one of the first to give a voice to the falsely accused, or the financially decimated man, using data to argue that the portrayal of men in divorce wasn't just a social issue, but a civil rights issue. However, the portrayal of divorced men is not a monolith. For every documentary that highlights systemic bias, there is another that examines the internal crisis of the male identity. These films often use a more cinema verite style, following men into support groups, basement apartments, and empty visitation centers. They capture the social death that often accompanies divorce for men in America. Unlike women, who historical trends show often maintain more robust social safety nets and community ties post-divorce, men frequently find their social circles tied directly to the marriage or the workplace. When the marriage ends, the social death begins. Documentaries that capture this reality provide a haunting counter-narrative to the happy bachelor trope. They show the potential outcomes of isolation, the decline in physical health, the loss of purpose, and the struggle to redefine masculinity in a world where the role of provider and protector has been stripped away. These films challenge the audience to look at the divorced man not through the lens of what he did, but through the lens of who he is, now that his primary identity has been dismantled. In this first part of our masterclass, we must also acknowledge the role of advocacy filmmaking and the controversies it creates. We will eventually look at films like The Red Pill, which sparked intense national debate by interviewing leaders of the men's rights movement. Regardless of one's personal politics, the documentary's portrayal of divorced men highlighted a significant gap in U.S. social services, the lack of domestic violence shelters for men, and the disparity in suicide prevention funding. The film used raw, unfiltered interviews to show men who felt completely abandoned by the state. This type of filmmaking represents a reactionary trend, a direct response to decades of what these filmmakers perceive as one-sided media coverage. By examining these case studies, we begin to see a map of the American psyche. We see a nation struggling to reconcile its traditional values with a modern reality, where 40 to 50% of marriages end in dissolution. We see a documentary record that is trying to catch up to a sociological shift that happened faster than our cultural scripts could handle. As we move forward into the next 9 parts of this series, we will break down the specific legal mechanics, the psychological archetypes, and the cinematic techniques that define this genre. We will look at how lighting, music, and editing are used to make you feel sympathy for one father while feeling suspicion toward another. This is the deep dive into the heart of the American family, as seen through the flickering light of the documentary camera. To understand the weight of these portrayals, we must first examine the visual grammar of the modern American divorce documentary. When a filmmaker sits down to edit a narrative about a father navigating the family court system in 2026, they are not just cutting clips. They are constructing a psychological profile that will be consumed by millions. This process begins with the aesthetic of isolation. Imagine a man named Mark, a 42-year-old software engineer living in a suburb of Chicago. In a documentary titled something like The Silent Split, Mark would likely be filmed in high-contrast, low-light settings. The camera might linger on a half-empty refrigerator or a stack of unopened mail on a kitchen island that was once the center of a bustling family life. This visual shorthand communicates a specific historical trend in U.S. media: the portrayal of the divorced man as a ghost in his own life. The filmmaker uses these shots to establish a baseline of sympathy, yet this sympathy is often tinged with a sense of pathetic resignation. By analyzing the cinematography used in films like Divorce Corp, we see a recurring pattern where men are often interviewed in office settings or sterile environments, which subtly frames their struggle as a cold, bureaucratic, or financial problem, rather than a deeply emotional or human one. Let us look at a specific case study that highlights the shift in documentary narrative. In the early 2000s, the dominant narrative was the hunt for the elusive deadbeat dad. Documentaries of that era often functioned like true crime procedurals, following law enforcement as they tracked down men who had fallen behind on child support. The narrative was one of personal moral failure. Fast forward to the landscape of 2026, and the documentary focus has pivoted significantly toward what filmmakers call the high-conflict trap. Now, instead of the man fleeing his responsibilities, we see a surge in documentaries portraying men who are desperately trying to overperform their responsibilities, but are being throttled by the legal-industrial complex. In these modern films, the man is often portrayed as a cash cow. The documentary narrative shifts from the man's moral character to the court's financial incentives. Historical trends show that as the cost of litigation has skyrocketed, filmmakers have found more resonance in stories where a father's entire retirement fund or home equity is consumed by legal fees in a matter of months. Imagine if you were Mark, the architect we mentioned earlier. You have no criminal record, you have been a present father since the day your daughter was born, and you suddenly find yourself in a 2026 documentary being used as an example of a silver bullet divorce. This is a term frequently explored in advocacy documentaries to describe the tactical use of restraining orders to gain immediate, temporary custody and move-out orders. In the documentary portrayal, we see the step-by-step deconstruction of Mark's life. The film would show his transition from a 3-bedroom house to a studio apartment. It would use data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics to show how his productivity at work has plummeted due to the stress of near-constant litigation. The documentary would then layer in expert testimony from psychologists discussing the potential outcomes of father absence, not because Mark chose to leave, but because the legal process effectively sidelined him. This creates a powerful high-retention narrative for a U.S. audience because it taps into a fundamental American fear that you can do everything right, follow every rule, and still lose everything to a system that operates behind closed doors. The psychological impact of these portrayals cannot be overstated. When documentaries focus on the suicide rates among divorced men, they often use a specific pacing. The music becomes somber, the cuts become slower, and the interviews with surviving family members are used to create an open loop of tragedy. Data frequently cited in these films suggests that the loss of the father identity is a primary driver of male self-harm post-divorce. In a 2026 documentary context, we might see a filmmaker exploring the digital footprint of a man's decline. They might show his social media transition from family photos to increasingly isolated posts, or his search history as he tries to navigate complex legal statutes on his own, because he can no longer afford an attorney. This is a recurring theme in films like Erasing Family, which focuses on the phenomenon of parental alienation. The documentary portrays the man not as an aggressor, but as a victim of psychological warfare. This is a radical departure from the media archetypes of the 1980s and 90s, and it reflects a broader cultural shift in how we understand male vulnerability. To add more value to this analysis, we must consider the financial data that these documentaries often highlight to shock the viewer. Many contemporary U.S. documentaries point to the fact that the family law system is the only branch of the judiciary where you are essentially presumed guilty until proven innocent in the context of temporary orders. They cite case studies where men are ordered to pay child support and alimony based on an attributed income, meaning what the court thinks they could earn, rather than what they are actually earning. In a high-stakes documentary, this is portrayed as the financial shredder. We see step-by-step how a man's credit score is destroyed, how his professional licenses might be suspended, and how he eventually becomes the very deadbeat dad archetype that the earlier documentaries mocked. The modern filmmaker is showing the audience the factory that produces the social problem. They are arguing that the historical trends we see are not the result of a sudden lapse in male character, but the logical potential outcomes of a system that prioritizes conflict over resolution. Furthermore, we see a growing trend in documentaries that explore the intersection of divorce and the veteran community in the United States. These films often portray a double trauma: the man who survives combat only to be defeated by a domestic court. The case studies in these films are particularly poignant, as they contrast the man's military service and discipline with his perceived helplessness in the face of a custody evaluator. By 2026, these documentaries have become a staple of streaming platforms, often using a gritty, realistic tone to demand legislative reform. They use the hero-to-victim arc to create maximum emotional resonance. They show the medals on the wall, then pan to the court order that prevents him from seeing his children on Veterans Day. This specific type of storytelling is designed to provoke outrage and action, moving the viewer from a state of passive observation to one of active advocacy. But there is a darker side to these portrayals that we must address. While many documentaries aim to humanize the divorced man, others continue to reinforce the bumbling incompetent trope. In lighter, more commercial documentaries about modern dating after 40, The divorced man is often portrayed as a project or a punchline. He is the man who does not know how to dress himself, who has a mattress on the floor, and who is desperately out of touch with modern social cues. This creates a jarring contrast with the serious, advocacy-driven films. It suggests that in the American consciousness, the divorced man exists in a state of superposition. He is simultaneously a victim of systemic injustice and a caricature of failed masculinity. The documentary record reflects this split personality of the culture. As we conclude this part of our masterclass, we have to ask ourselves, who is actually winning in this scenario? If the documentaries are showing a system that shreds families and a media landscape that oscillates between demonization and pity, what is the common denominator? Why does the system seem to resist the very reforms that these documentaries have been advocating for over 20 years? In the next part of this series, we are going to look at the gatekeepers. We are going to dive deep into the portrayal of the judges, the custody evaluators, and the shadow industry of supervised visitation centers. We will explore how documentaries have attempted to pull back the curtain on the most powerful people in the room. People who can end a man's relationship with his children with a single stroke of a pen. We will look at the secret recordings, the leaked transcripts, and the high-stakes confrontations that define the next level of this deep dive. If you think the financial shredder was intense, wait until you see how the documentary lens captures the absolute power of the bench. To understand the absolute power of the bench, we must first look at the unique structure of the U.S. family court system, which documentaries often portray as a shadow judiciary operating outside the constitutional protections found in criminal law. In a standard criminal trial, a defendant is protected by the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments. There are clear sentencing guidelines and a high burden of proof. However, as modern documentaries like Divorce Corp and Erasing Family highlight, the family court operates under the doctrine of equity, where the primary guiding principle is the best interests of the child. While this sounds noble in theory, filmmakers meticulously document how this vague standard grants a single judge nearly total discretion over a man's life, his assets, and his relationship with his children. The documentary lens often captures the judge as an almost monarchical figure. When the camera pans across a courtroom in a 2026 documentary feature, the focus is rarely on the legal arguments, but on the facial expressions of the judge. Historical trends suggest that in many jurisdictions, the personal biases, mood, or even the lunch schedule of a judge can have a more significant impact on the potential outcomes of a custody hearing than 20 years of documented parenting. Consider the case study of David, a 45-year-old middle manager in Atlanta, Georgia. In a 2026 documentary titled The Bench's Shadow, we follow David as he enters his 12th month of litigation. The filmmaker uses a handheld camera to follow David into the courthouse, capturing the frantic, high-pressure atmosphere of the hallway cattle call. David has exactly 7 minutes to present his case before a judge, who has a docket of 40 other families that day. The documentary highlights a staggering statistic. In many major U.S. metropolitan areas, a family court judge may make life-altering decisions for a child based on less than 15 minutes of direct observation. This creates what filmmakers call the judicial disconnect. The documentary portrays David as a man trying to explain a decade of fatherhood in a soundbite, while the judge, portrayed through low-angle shots that emphasize their height and distance, barely looks up from their paperwork. This visual storytelling reinforces the narrative that for the divorced man, the courtroom is not a place of healing or justice, but a bureaucratic meat grinder. Step by step, these documentaries pull back the curtain on the industry of experts that the bench relies upon. This is where we encounter the custody evaluator, often referred to in these films as the hired gun. Imagine if you were David. The judge decides they don't have enough information to make a ruling, so they appoint a private psychologist to conduct a custody evaluation. In 2026, these evaluations can cost anywhere from $15,000 to $50,000, and historical trends show that the costs are almost always split between the parties or burdened heavily onto the higher earner, which is statistically the father. The documentary camera follows the evaluator, not the man. It shows the evaluator's cozy relationship with the attorneys, the shared lunches, and the revolving door of referrals. These films argue that a shadow economy exists where judges, evaluators, and lawyers form a tight-knit circle. The documentary portrayal of the evaluator is often sinister. They are the ones who hold the real power because, as the data shows, judges follow the recommendations of these evaluators in over 90% of cases. For David, the evaluator's report is the final word. Yet the documentary reveals that these reports are often based on subjective psychological tests that have been criticized for their lack of scientific rigor in a forensic context. Another harrowing layer captured by the documentary camera is the reality of supervised visitation centers. This is perhaps the most emotionally charged segment of any film portraying divorced men. Imagine if you were told that you could only see your children for 2 hours a week, inside a windowless room in a strip mall, while a stranger with a clipboard takes notes on your every interaction. Documentaries like Erasing Family provide a raw look at these centers, which have become a multi-million-dollar industry in the United States. The cinematography in these scenes is intentionally claustrophobic. We see the man trying to play a board game with his son while a camera looms overhead. We see the sign-in sheets where the father must pay an hourly fee, sometimes upwards of $100 an hour, just for the privilege of being a parent. The documentary highlights the potential outcomes of this environment. Children become traumatized by the clinical setting, and fathers eventually stop coming because they can no longer afford the fee or the emotional degradation. The film portrays this not as a safety measure, but as a profit-driven obstacle that effectively severs the paternal bond. To add more depth, let us examine the role of the guardian ad litem, or GAL. In many 2026 documentary narratives, the GAL is portrayed as an unpredictable variable. These are individuals appointed by the court to represent the child's interests, yet they often have no specialized training in child psychology or social work. Documentaries use case studies to show how a GAL can spend only an hour with a child, and then submit a report that contradicts years of school records and medical history. The filmmakers often use interviews with former GALs who have turned whistleblowers, describing a system where they are pressured to maintain the status quo to keep receiving court appointments. This creates a high-retention narrative for the viewer because it exposes a lack of oversight. There is no body of government that effectively polices these court-appointed experts. If a man like David feels his GL is biased or incompetent, the documentary shows that his only recourse is to file a motion with the very judge who appointed the GAL in the first place, a move that historical trends show is almost always unsuccessful and often results in judicial retaliation. The value of these documentaries lies in their ability to quantify the unquantifiable. They use data to show that the U.S. family court system is the only place where a citizen can be stripped of their property, their income, and their children without a jury trial. By 2026, the documentary record has moved beyond mere anecdotal evidence. Filmmakers are now using sophisticated data visualizations to show the correlation between judicial appointments and campaign contributions from family law firms. They are showing how the system is self-perpetuating. The more conflict there is, the more experts are needed. The more experts are needed, the more money flows through the courthouse. The divorced man is portrayed as the fuel for this engine. We see him in these films as a man who is being bled dry both emotionally and financially, while the gatekeepers, the judges, the evaluators, and the GALs remain insulated by judicial immunity. But what happens when the pressure becomes too much? What happens when the man realizes that the system is not just indifferent but actively hostile? Documentaries are increasingly focusing on the moment of the breaking point. They follow men who have spent their entire life savings on a system that refused to hear them. These films use the open loop of the man's future to keep the audience engaged. Will David get his 50-50 custody? Or will he become another statistic in the next documentary about the suicide crisis? The film doesn't give a simple answer because, in the U.S. family court system of 2026, there are no simple answers. This brings us to a terrifying realization that many filmmakers are starting to explore. While the financial and institutional hurdles are immense, there is a specific weapon used within the system that can end a case before it even begins. It is the ultimate trump card in the deck of family law, and its portrayal in documentaries has become the most controversial topic in the genre. In the next part of this deep dive, we are going to look at the anatomy of the false allegation. We will explore how a single unsubstantiated claim of domestic violence or child abuse can be used as a tactical nuclear weapon in a custody battle. We will look at the documentaries that have dared to interview the men who were cleared of all charges but still lost everything, and the potential outcomes of a system that prioritizes a better safe than sorry approach at the cost of the father-child bond. The bench has the power, but as you will see, the allegations are the fuel that drives the gavel down. The fuel that drives the gavel down is often found in a single, typed document: the affidavit for an emergency restraining order. In the ecosystem of U.S. documentaries exploring the male divorce experience, this is frequently referred to as the silver bullet. To understand why this term is so prevalent in the documentary record of 2026, we have to look at the step-by-step mechanics of how a legal allegation is portrayed as a strategic maneuver. Documentaries like Divorce Corp and more recent investigative features have dedicated entire segments to the ease with which a temporary protective order can be obtained. Imagine a man named Michael, a middle school history teacher in Ohio. In a documentary exploring the intersection of career and divorce, we see Michael's life dismantled in a matter of hours. Without a single witness, without a police report, and without Michael even being present in the courtroom, an ex parte order is signed. The documentary camera captures the potential outcomes of this moment with clinical precision. Michael is served at his place of employment. In the eyes of the school board, the mere existence of the order, despite it being a temporary civil matter, triggers an immediate administrative leave. The film shows Michael walking out of the school with his belongings in a cardboard box, a visual metaphor for the immediate presumption of guilt that permeates the family law landscape. Historical trends analyzed in these documentaries suggest that in high-conflict divorces, the filing of a domestic violence allegation increases the likelihood of the accuser receiving the marital home and temporary primary custody by over 70% in certain jurisdictions. Filmmakers use these data points to argue that the system has created a moral hazard. By prioritizing a better safe than sorry policy, the courts have inadvertently incentivized the use of allegations as a tactical tool to gain leverage in financial and custody negotiations. The documentary lens often focuses on the due process gap. In a criminal court, Michael would have the right to confront his accuser, the right to an attorney if he couldn't afford one, and the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But in the family court documentaries of the 2020s, we see that the standard is the preponderance of evidence, essentially a 51% likelihood. The films portray this as a coin toss where the stakes are a man's home, his reputation, and his children. The cinematic portrayal of these allegations often utilizes the trope of the scarlet letter. Even if the allegation is later found to be unsubstantiated or completely fabricated, the documentary record shows that the damage to the male subject is often permanent. We see case studies of men who, years after their cases were dismissed, still struggle with the digital footprint of the initial filing. Filmmakers interviewed digital reputation managers who explained that in 2026, a simple background check by a potential employer or a new landlord will surface the initial headlines or court filings, but rarely the subsequent exoneration. This creates a narrative of the permanent outsider. The documentary follows Michael as he applies for jobs at other school districts, only to have the offers rescinded once the protective order history is uncovered. The filmmaker is not just telling a story of a divorce. They are telling a story of the systematic erasure of a man's professional identity. Furthermore, these documentaries dive deep into the role of restraining order mills. These are portrayed as legal clinics or advocacy groups that, according to the filmmakers, provide templates and coaching on how to frame arguments to ensure a judge grants an emergency order. The films use hidden camera footage or interviews with disgruntled former employees to show a production line approach to litigation. Step by step, the documentaries illustrate how a verbal argument about a household budget can be transformed in an affidavit into a credible threat of violence. The potential outcomes of this coaching are shown through the lens of the man who is suddenly barred from his own property. We see footage of men sleeping in their cars or in budget motels, unable to retrieve even their basic work attire or medication, while the legal process grinds on for months before a full hearing is ever scheduled. To add more value to this analysis, we must look at how these films portray the psychological toll of the false or exaggerated allegation. Psychologists interviewed in these documentaries describe a phenomenon known as legal abuse syndrome. They argue that for many men, the shock of being branded a predator or a danger to their children causes a form of post-traumatic stress that often makes them appear unstable or angry in court, which the opposing counsel then uses as further evidence of their dangerous nature. This is the circular trap that documentaries like The Red Pill and various independent features on YouTube have attempted to expose. The filmmaker uses a fast-paced, high-tension editing style to mirror the man's internal state. They show the rapid-fire succession of legal filings, the mounting debt from attorney fees, and the isolation from family and friends who distance themselves because of the stigma attached to the allegations. Case studies in 2026 documentaries also highlight the intersection of technology and allegations. We see the rise of the digital evidence documentary, where filmmakers analyze how text messages, social media posts, and even smart home data are being weaponized. A man's frustrated text message, sent in the heat of a high-conflict separation, is blown up on a courtroom screen and analyzed by the filmmaker to show how easily context can be stripped away. The documentary portrays the man as someone who must live under constant surveillance, knowing that every word he speaks or types could be the fuel for the next emergency motion. This creates an atmosphere of paranoia that the filmmaker uses to keep the audience engaged, asking the question, in an age of total information, how can any man survive a high-conflict divorce? The documentaries also explore the financial incentives for the state. They point to the historical trends of federal funding, provided to states through programs like the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA. While acknowledging the vital importance of protecting actual victims, the documentaries often interview legal scholars who suggest that the broad definitions and lack of penalties for perjury in family court have led to an over-application of the law. The films use data to show the correlation between the number of restraining orders issued and the amount of federal grant money received by a county. This moves the narrative from a personal domestic dispute to a systemic financial issue, portraying the divorced man as a sacrificial lamb in a much larger bureaucratic machine. The deeper we go into the documentary record, the more we see that the allegation is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long-term financial and social restructuring. The film shows how the initial restraining order sets the status quo for custody, which then dictates the amount of child support and alimony. By the time the case reaches a final trial, often 2 or 3 years later, the man has been a visitor in his children's lives for so long that the court is hesitant to change the routine. This is portrayed as the slow-motion theft of fatherhood. The documentary closes the loop on Michael's story by showing him sitting in a park, watching other fathers play with their children, while he waits for his supervised hour to begin. But even as the man grapples with the loss of his reputation and his family, another storm is gathering on the horizon. While the allegations attack his character, the next phase of the process is designed to dismantle his future. We are moving from the courtroom of character to the ledger of life. In the next part of this deep dive, we will examine the portrayal of the financial execution. We will look at the documentaries that expose the mathematics of alimony and child support in 2026, where the potential outcomes are not just poverty, but a form of modern indentured servitude. We will explore the case studies of men whose tax returns and bank statements are treated like forensic evidence in a crime they didn't know they were committing. The gavel has fallen on Michael's character. Now we see how it falls on his wallet. When the ledger of life is opened in the family courtrooms of 2026, the documentary lens shifts from the emotional to the mathematical, revealing what many filmmakers describe as a calculated liquidation of the male future. This is the stage of the deep dive where we move beyond the courtroom drama and into the cold, hard spreadsheets of spousal maintenance and child support formulas. In the United States, documentaries like Divorce Corp and various investigative pieces on the social-industrial complex have highlighted a historical trend that positions the higher-earning spouse, statistically more often the man, as a perpetual annuity for the state and the opposing party. To understand the depth of this financial execution, we must look at the step-by-step mechanics of income imputation and the hidden federal incentives that drive aggressive collection. Imagine a man named James, a 48-year-old project manager in Phoenix, Arizona. In a 2026 documentary feature titled The Working Ghost, we follow James through the financial discovery process. This is not just a casual look at bank statements, it is a forensic invasion. The filmmaker captures the potential outcomes of a system that views James's future earning capacity not as a personal asset, but as a community resource. During the discovery phase, James is required to produce 5 years of tax returns, every credit card statement, retirement account balances, and even his business expense reports. The documentary uses high-pacing graphics to show how the legal teams analyze his lifestyle to determine his imputed income. Even if James were to lose his high-stress job tomorrow due to the psychological toll of the divorce, the court, as documented in several case studies, often maintains his support obligations based on what he earned at his peak. This creates a scenario where James is legally mandated to remain in a high-pressure environment simply to satisfy a court-ordered ledger, a situation filmmakers frequently liken to modern indentured servitude. A critical point of depth often explored in masterclass-level documentaries is the Title 4D of the Social Security Act. This is the hidden engine of the U.S. child support system. Documentaries like Support System Down provide a meticulous breakdown of how the federal government provides incentive payments to individual states for every dollar of child support they collect. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a matter of public record and federal law. The filmmaker illustrates how this creates a conflict of interest. If the state receives a percentage of the total support collected, the state has a direct financial incentive to set support orders as high as possible and to favor a primary custody with visitation model over 50-50 shared parenting. Why? Because shared parenting often results in lower or zeroed-out child support transfers, which would decrease the federal kickback to the state treasury. By 2026, documentaries have begun to frame this not just as a domestic issue, but as a systemic wealth transfer facilitated by the government. Let us expand on James's case study to see the secondary impact of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which remains a cornerstone of the 2026 financial landscape. For decades, alimony was tax-deductible for the payer and taxable for the recipient. The documentary record shows how the reversal of this law has created a tax on a tax for divorced men. James now pays his ex-wife alimony using after-tax dollars. This means he is taxed on the full amount of his $120,000 salary, even though $40,000 of it is immediately transferred to his former spouse. Meanwhile, the recipient receives that money tax-free. Documentaries use side-by-side visual comparisons to show the effective poverty level of the pair. We see James in a one-bedroom apartment, eating basic meals, while his gross income suggests he should be living a comfortable upper-middle-class life. The filmmaker's goal is to expose the disparity between a man's paper wealth and his actual liquidity. Furthermore, these documentaries dive into the shadow economy of forensic experts. Imagine if you were James and your ex-wife's attorney hired a vocational expert to testify that you are underemployed. The documentary shows the step-by-step process of this testimony. The expert, who is being paid by the opposing side, presents a report stating that with your skills, you could be earning 20% more if you moved to a different city or worked 80 hours a week. The judge, relying on this expert, imputes that higher income to you. The potential outcomes are catastrophic. Your support orders are now based on money you do not make and perhaps never will make. This is a recurring theme in films that portray the divorced man as being caught in a financial pincer move. His actual income is falling due to litigation stress, while his court-ordered obligations are rising based on theoretical potential. The documentary lens also captures the absolute brutality of the contempt of court mechanic. In the United States, if James fails to pay his support, he does not just face a civil judgment or a ding on his credit report. He faces the loss of his liberty. Filmmakers follow men into the jail and release cycle, showing how the system treats inability to pay the same as a willful refusal to pay. The documentary highlights the irony. By jailing a man for non-payment, the state ensures he loses his job, making future payments impossible. This is portrayed as a self-perpetuating cycle of failure that disproportionately affects men who have already been liquidated of their assets. Historical trends show that once a man falls behind due to a job loss or health crisis, the interest and penalties on the arrears make it statistically unlikely he will ever catch up. To add even more value, we must look at how documentaries portray the destruction of the retirement nest egg. We see the implementation of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. The film shows the moment James realizes that the 401k he spent 25 years building is being split in half, but the penalties and taxes for the withdrawal are often skewed. The documentary portrays the divorced man as a person who has had his past erased through the loss of his home, and his future mortgaged through the loss of his retirement. He is left in a perpetual present of labor, working solely to fund a life he is no longer allowed to lead. The depth of these films often reaches into the psychological impact of this financial crushing. Psychologists in 2026 documentaries discuss the concept of cognitive scarcity. When a man is constantly worrying about the next $5,000 legal bill or the next support payment, his ability to function at a high level in other areas of life diminishes. The filmmaker uses fast-paced montages of bills, court notices, and empty bank accounts to create a sense of overwhelming dread. They are showing the audience that the financial execution is not just about money, it is about the total depletion of the man's agency. As we wrap up this portion of the masterclass, we have seen how the system takes the man's character through allegations and his future through the ledger. James is now a man with no home, half a retirement, and a legal mandate to work at peak capacity until he is 65 or 70. But there is one more thing the system can take, and it is something that no amount of money can replace. It is the biological and neurological bond between a father and his children. While the money is being moved, a more subtle and devastating process is happening in the shadows of the child's mind. In the next part of this series, we will explore the portrayal of parental alienation. We will look at the documentaries that have captured the step-by-step process of how a child is taught to fear or hate the father they once loved. We will dive into the science of the brain, the tactics of the alienator, and the potential outcomes for a generation of children growing up in a world of manufactured absence. The financial shredder is painful, but the erasure of a father's love is the ultimate documentary tragedy. The erasure of a father's love is the ultimate documentary tragedy, and in the landscape of 2026 filmmaking, this tragedy is defined by a singular, controversial term: parental alienation. To understand the depth of this phenomenon as portrayed in American media, we must look at how documentaries like Erasing Family and various independent investigative projects have meticulously mapped the step-by-step psychological dismantling of the paternal bond. This is not merely a social disagreement. The documentary record portrays it as a form of high-stakes psychological warfare where the child is both the prize and the primary casualty. Imagine a man named Robert, a 50-year-old civil engineer living in a quiet suburb of Seattle. In a 2026 documentary titled The Ghost in the Hallway, the filmmaker uses a series of time-lapse sequences to show the literal removal of Robert's existence from his children's lives. First, the family photos on the wall are replaced. Then, his name is no longer mentioned at the dinner table. Finally, his phone calls go unanswered. Step by step, the documentary illustrates the historical trends of what experts call the poisoning of the well. The film highlights how one parent can use subtle, repetitive programming to convince a child that the other parent is not only unloving but dangerous. For Robert, the potential outcomes of this process are devastating. He goes from being the father who coached every soccer game to a man who is greeted with a cold, rehearsed stare from his 12-year-old son during a court-ordered exchange. Documentaries in this genre focus heavily on the neurobiology of the child caught in the crossfire. Filmmakers interview neurologists who use brain imaging data to show the physiological impact of a loyalty bind. When a child is forced to choose between two parents they love, the stress response in the brain is akin to that of a soldier in active combat. The documentary lens captures the child's survival mechanism. To alleviate the unbearable internal tension, the child aligns with the alienating parent and rejects the target parent. In the 2026 cinematic narrative, this is portrayed as a tragic necessity for the child's mental survival. The film uses high-retention visual metaphors, such as a bridge being systematically dismantled from one side, to show that the father is not being pushed away by the child's choice, but by a survival instinct triggered by the primary caregiver. Historical trends analyzed in these films suggest that the U.S. legal system is woefully unequipped to handle these cases. Documentaries often feature case studies where a father like Robert brings evidence of alienation to the court, recordings of the mother telling the children he doesn't love them, or emails showing the systematic blocking of his scheduled time, only to have the judge dismiss it as high-conflict parenting. The filmmaker portrays the judicial system's blind spot as a catastrophic failure of due process. By 2026, documentaries have begun to expose the potential outcomes of this systemic denial, showing how a generation of alienated children often grow up to struggle with substance abuse, identity crises, and their own relationship failures, often realizing only in adulthood that they were manipulated into hating a father who desperately wanted to be in their lives. To add more value to this analysis, we must examine the specific tactics highlighted in modern advocacy films. One such tactic is the manufacturing of fear. The documentary shows how an alienating parent can take a mundane event, like Robert forgetting to pack a specific toy, and frame it to the child as a sign of neglect or lack of safety. Over months of repetition, the child's memory is reconstructed. The filmmaker uses side-by-side comparisons of real events versus the child's later testimony to show the distortion. This creates a powerful narrative of gaslighting that resonates deeply with U.S. audiences who are increasingly aware of psychological manipulation. The film portrays the divorced man not as a victim of a single event, but as a victim of a long-term, calculated erosion of his character in the mind of his offspring. Furthermore, these documentaries dive into the industry of reunification therapy. Imagine if you were Robert, and after 2 years of being erased, a judge finally realizes what is happening and orders you and your children into a specialized therapy program. The documentary camera follows this process, which can cost families tens of thousands of dollars. The filmmaker examines the controversial nature of these programs, where children are sometimes physically removed from the alienating parent and placed in a therapeutic setting with the father. The potential outcomes of these interventions are a major focus of 2026 documentaries, with filmmakers exploring both the successes of restored bonds and the intense criticism from those who view the process as further trauma for the child. This creates an open loop of moral ambiguity. Is the forceful restoration of a bond better than the permanent erasure of a parent? The value of these films lies in their ability to humanize the statistical reality. Data frequently cited in 2026 documentaries indicates that parental alienation is present in up to 15% of all divorce cases in the United States, yet it remains one of the least understood psychological phenomena in the courtroom. Filmmakers use case studies to show the sheer exhaustion of the alienated father. We see Robert sitting in his car outside a school, watching from a distance as his children walk past him, knowing that if he approaches them, he risks a restraining order for harassment. The documentary portrays this as a form of living grief. The father is grieving for children who are still alive, but who have been taught to view him as a stranger. To provide even more depth, we must consider the role of social media in modern alienation. Documentaries in 2026 analyze how digital platforms are used to broadcast the erasure. The film shows how the alienating parent posts photos of a new partner with the children, often using captions that imply the new partner is the real father. This public-facing narrative serves to reinforce the child's internal programming and further isolates the biological father. The documentary filmmaker illustrates how the digital footprint of a divorce can become a permanent archive of the father's exclusion, making it even harder for the bond to be repaired in the future. As we look at the potential outcomes for men like Robert, the documentary record becomes a call to action. These films argue for a shift in family law toward a presumption of equal shared parenting from day one. They suggest that when both parents are legally and socially expected to be present, the opportunity for one parent to erase the other is significantly diminished. The documentary closes Robert's chapter by showing him at a support group for alienated parents, where he finds a community of men who are all enduring the same silent tragedy. The filmmaker uses a wide-angle shot of the room to show that Robert is not an anomaly. He is part of a growing demographic of American fathers who have been legally and psychologically displaced. But while the erasure of the father-child bond is a devastating blow, it has also sparked a massive, collective response that is changing the face of American activism. A new wave of documentaries is no longer just focusing on the tragedy. They are focusing on the resistance. The divorced man is finding his voice not just in the courtroom, but in the halls of Congress and on the streets of major cities. In the next part of this masterclass, we will explore the portrayal of the fatherhood movement. We will look at the documentaries that have captured the rise of a new civil rights struggle, where men are organizing to demand equal rights under the law. We will dive into the high-stakes world of legislative lobbying, the controversial figures who lead these movements, and the potential outcomes of a movement that aims to dismantle the $50 billion divorce industry once and for all. The tragedy has turned into a fight, and the cameras are there to catch every blow. The transition from the solitary grief of parental alienation to the collective power of organized activism is one of the most compelling arcs in modern American documentary filmmaking. By the year 2026, a new subgenre has emerged, the resistance documentary. These films no longer focus solely on the destruction of the individual father. Instead, they chronicle the birth of a sophisticated, data-driven movement that views the family court system as the last great civil rights battleground in the United States. To understand this shift, we must examine how filmmakers portray the transformation of men from broken litigants into disciplined advocates. This is not a story of anger, but a story of strategy, lobbying, and the systematic dismantling of a $50 billion industry. Imagine a man named Thomas, a 55-year-old former commercial pilot based in Austin, Texas. In a 2026 documentary titled The Gavel and the Grassroots, we follow Thomas through a 3-year journey that begins with him losing his home and ends with him testifying before a state Senate committee. The filmmaker uses a high-retention narrative structure to show how Thomas, after being liquidated by the financial shredder we discussed in previous parts, finds a community of thousands of men online who have faced identical potential outcomes. The documentary illustrates the step-by-step process of how these men move from venting in private forums to organizing public-facing campaigns. They use the same forensic tools used against them, data analysis, financial auditing, and legal research, to expose the flaws in the system that govern their lives. One of the key historical trends highlighted in these documentaries is the push for rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting. Filmmakers focus on states like Florida, which in 2023 passed landmark legislation making 50-50 custody the starting point for all divorce cases. The documentary lens captures the intense lobbying efforts that led to this change. We see men in suits walking the halls of state capitals, armed with binders of social science data showing that children with active fathers have lower rates of incarceration, teen pregnancy, and substance abuse. The film portrays these men as the new face of civil rights, using the language of equality to challenge the traditional tender years doctrine that once dominated the courts. By 2026, documentaries are analyzing the potential outcomes of these laws in real time, showing a decrease in high-conflict litigation in states that have adopted equal parenting as the default. The value of these documentaries lies in their ability to expose the financial mechanics of the resistance. Filmmakers dive deep into the world of legislative lobbying, showing how the divorce industry, comprised of bar associations and trade groups for evaluators, spends millions of dollars to oppose these reforms. The documentary portrays this as a David versus Goliath struggle. We see Thomas and his group of volunteers operating on a shoestring budget, using social media to bypass traditional media gatekeepers. They are shown crowdfunding for billboards that ask simple, provocative questions. Why is a father a visitor in his own child's life? Why does the state profit from parental conflict? The film uses fast-paced editing to mirror the momentum of the movement, creating a sense of inevitable change that keeps the viewer engaged. Case studies in 2026 documentaries also explore the rise of the pro-SE movement. These are men who, after being drained of their life savings by legal fees, choose to represent themselves in court. The filmmaker portrays this not as an act of desperation, but as a calculated tactical shift. We see Thomas teaching other men how to file motions, how to cross-examine expert witnesses, and how to use the rules of evidence to protect their rights. The documentary highlights the potential outcomes of this trend. As more men become legally self-sufficient, the profit margins of the family law firms begin to shrink. This is portrayed as the first step in dismantling the industrial complex of divorce. The film uses interviews with legal scholars who explain that the pro-SE movement is forcing the courts to simplify their procedures, making justice more accessible to the average American father. To add even more depth, we must examine how these films portray the intersection of the fatherhood movement and modern technology. In 2026, documentaries are highlighting the use of artificial intelligence and blockchain technology to create transparent records of court proceedings and support payments. The filmmaker shows how activists are building independent databases to track the rulings of specific judges, exposing historical trends of bias that were previously hidden in sealed records. This use of big data is portrayed as the ultimate sunlight that disinfects the system. For a man like Thomas, this technology provides the evidence he needs to prove that his experience was not a personal failure, but a statistical probability within a biased framework. The documentaries also explore the psychological evolution of the activist father. Psychologists interviewed in these films describe a phenomenon known as post-traumatic growth. They argue that for many men, the fight for legislative reform provides a sense of purpose that helps them heal from the trauma of their own divorce. The filmmaker captures this through intimate interviews where men like Thomas discuss how they have found a new sense of brotherhood and mission. This narrative arc, moving from victim to survivor to leader, is a powerful tool for high retention, as it offers the audience a sense of hope and agency in the face of a seemingly insurmountable system. However, the documentary record also captures the high-stakes confrontations that occur when the movement meets the status quo. We see footage of heated public hearings where mothers' advocacy groups and fathers' rights groups clash over the definition of the best interests of the child. The filmmaker does not shy away from the complexity of these debates, showing how both sides use powerful emotional narratives to influence public opinion. The documentary portrays the struggle for equal parenting not as a gender war, but as a fundamental debate about the role of the state in the American family. By 2026, the question being asked is no longer if the system will change, but how fast. As we look at the potential outcomes of this movement, the documentaries provide a vision of a restructured society. They show a future where divorce is no longer a zero-sum game, where the state no longer has a financial incentive to foster conflict, and where the bond between a father and his child is protected by law, rather than left to the discretion of a single judge. The film closes Thomas's story with him standing on the steps of the Capitol after a successful vote, surrounded by other fathers who have regained their rights. It is a moment of triumph, but the filmmaker uses a wide-angle shot to remind the audience that the victory is bittersweet. It came at a cost that can never truly be repaid. But even as the movement gains ground and the laws begin to shift, there is a shadow that continues to haunt the documentary record. While the legal and financial structures are being challenged, there is an internal silent battle that many men are still fighting in the dark. The victory at the Capitol does not automatically heal the psychological scars of years of isolation and character assassination. In the next part of this masterclass, we will go deeper into the dark night of the soul. We will examine the portrayal of the mental health crisis among divorced men, the silent epidemic of depression and substance abuse, and the documentaries that have dared to look at the men who didn't make it to the Capitol steps. We will explore the potential outcomes of a system that leaves men with the legal right to be a father, but with a psyche that has been pushed to the absolute brink. The fight is won in the legislature, but the war is often lost in the mind. The war in the mind is where the most devastating potential outcomes of the American divorce experience are realized. Yet it remains the most difficult territory for documentary filmmakers to map. While Part 7 explored the external fight for legislative change, Part 8 must dive into the internal collapse that often precedes or follows those legal battles. In 2026, the documentary record has shifted toward an unflinching look at the mental health crisis among divorced men, a demographic that historical trends show is uniquely vulnerable to a phenomenon known as disenfranchised grief. This is a form of sorrow that is not socially validated or openly acknowledged, leaving men to navigate a psychological vacuum. To understand this, we must look at the step-by-step erosion of the male psyche, as portrayed in recent investigative features. Imagine a man named Brian, a 44-year-old former firefighter in Denver. In a 2026 documentary titled The Empty Quarter, the camera follows Brian as he navigates his first year of post-divorce life. Brian is a man who was trained to run into burning buildings, yet the film portrays him as utterly paralyzed by the silence of his two-bedroom apartment. The filmmaker uses a specific auditory technique, layering the ambient sounds of a bustling household, children laughing, a television humming, the clinking of dishes, over shots of Brian sitting alone in a sterile kitchen. This visual and auditory contrast highlights the identity void. For Brian, being a father and a husband was not just a role. It was his primary orientation to the world. When that orientation is stripped away by a court order, the documentary illustrates how a man's internal compass begins to spin. Historical trends analyzed in these films suggest that men often experience divorce as a total loss of purpose, which in the United States is frequently tied to their status as a provider and a domestic anchor. Documentaries like The Mask You Live In have laid the groundwork for this discussion, but the 2026 era of filmmaking goes deeper into the neurological impact of litigation trauma. Filmmakers interview clinical psychologists who explain that the adversarial nature of the U.S. family court system keeps men in a state of chronic sympathetic nervous system activation, the fight-or-flight response. For Brian, this means his brain is effectively under siege for years. The documentary shows the physical toll: the weight gain, the graying hair, and the tremor in his hands as he opens yet another legal envelope. This is portrayed not as a personal weakness, but as the physiological potential outcome of a system designed for conflict. Step by step, the documentary explores the phenomenon of social death. In Brian's case study, we see how his social circle, largely composed of other married couples, begins to contract. The filmmaker uses a time-lapse of Brian's phone logs to show the steady decline in incoming calls and texts. In the American social fabric, the divorced man is often viewed as a liability or an awkward reminder of marital fragility. The film portrays Brian as an invisible man, someone who is still physically present in his community, but who has been socially excommunicated. This isolation is a primary driver of the substance abuse epidemic that documentaries are increasingly highlighting. We see Brian standing in the liquor aisle of a grocery store, a scene that filmmakers used to illustrate the transition from social drinking to solitary numbing. Data cited in these films shows that divorced men are significantly more likely to develop alcohol and opioid dependencies as they attempt to self-medicate the pain of family separation. To add more value to this deep dive, we must examine how documentaries portray the failure of the American mental health system to reach these men. Many films in 2026 critique the traditional clinical model, which often relies on talk therapy, a medium that historical trends show many men find difficult to access when they are in the midst of a crisis. Instead, documentaries are showcasing the rise of the underground support network. We see Brian joining a clandestine hiking group for divorced fathers, where the therapy happens not in a chair, but on a trail. The filmmaker captures the raw, unfiltered conversations that occur when men feel safe from the judgment of the court or the scrutiny of social media. These films argue that for the American divorced man, healing often requires a redefinition of masculinity, that allows for vulnerability without the fear of it being weaponized in a custody hearing. The documentary lens also captures the dark reality of the suicide crisis. In a high-retention segment, the film might present a wall of names, men who, like Brian, were once the pillars of their families but who reached a breaking point. The filmmaker uses case studies of the families left behind to illustrate the permanent impact of a system that prioritizes legal win-loss records over human life. By 2026, documentaries are using data visualization to show the correlation between the loss of visitation rights and the spike in male self-harm. This is the most controversial and high-stakes portion of the masterclass, as it challenges the audience to view the family court not just as a legal institution, but as a public health factor. The film portrays the divorced man's mental health as a neglected infrastructure, one that is crumbling under the weight of outdated social scripts and aggressive litigation. Furthermore, we must look at the role of the digital echo chamber in 2026. Documentaries are exploring how the internet provides both a lifeline and a trap for men in the dark night of the soul. We see Brian scrolling through social media at 2 a.m., bombarded by images of his former life or, conversely, by radicalized content that feeds his resentment. The filmmaker illustrates how the algorithms of 2026 can steer a grieving man toward extreme ideologies as he searches for answers to his pain. This adds a layer of complexity to the documentary narrative. The divorced man is not just fighting the court in his own mind, but an information environment that is designed to monetize his anger and his isolation. The value of these documentaries lies in their ability to bridge the gap between the individual tragedy and the collective experience. They show that Brian is not alone, even though he feels like the only person on earth going through this. The film uses a montage of men from different backgrounds: an auto mechanic in Detroit, a lawyer in Manhattan, a teacher in Oregon, all staring at the same four walls of their post-divorce apartments. This visual synchronicity creates a powerful sense of shared struggle, moving the viewer from a place of pity to a place of empathy and understanding. As we look at the potential outcomes for Brian, the documentary offers a glimmer of hope through the concept of the second act. The filmmaker captures Brian's slow, agonizing process of rebuilding a life that is no longer centered on the nuclear family. We see him volunteering at a local youth center, finding a new way to exercise his paternal instincts. We see him attending a cooking class, learning to care for himself in ways he never had to before. This is the portrayal of the resilient man, the one who survives the shredder and the silence. The film suggests that while the war in the mind is brutal, it can be survived through a combination of community, self-compassion, and a radical commitment to staying alive for the sake of the children who still need a father, even if that fatherhood is currently lived in the margins. But as Brian begins to heal, a new question arises in the documentary narrative. If the individual can find a way to survive, what happens to the culture at large? If millions of men are moving through this cycle of destruction and reconstruction, how is it changing the way we view marriage, commitment, and the future of the American family? The documentary record is now turning its attention to the final frontier, the evolution of the next generation. In the next part of this deep dive, we will explore the portrayal of the legacy. We will look at the documentaries that follow the children of these divorced men as they enter adulthood in 2026. How has the portrayal of their fathers shaped their own views on love and the law? We will dive into the rise of the child-led advocacy movement and the potential outcomes for a society that is finally listening to the voices of those who were once just pawns in the gavel's shadow. The war in the mind is a personal battle, but the legacy is a national story. The national story of the American family in 2026 is no longer being written solely by the parents who lived through the divorce or the lawyers who profited from it. Instead, the narrative has shifted to the generation that grew up in the shadow of the gavel. To understand the legacy of how U.S. documentaries have portrayed divorced men, we must look at the adult children who are now using their own voices to deconstruct the myths of their childhood. This is the era of the ACOD, Adult Children of Divorce Advocacy, a movement that is using filmmaking to bridge the gap between historical trends of father absence and the modern reality of psychological recovery. In this part of the masterclass, we will analyze the step-by-step process of how the next generation is redefining the male image through a lens of reconciliation and systemic critique. Imagine a man named Leo, a 24-year-old graphic designer in Houston. In a 2026 documentary titled The Echoes of Marcus, we follow Leo as he discovers a box of old legal documents and VHS tapes belonging to his father Marcus, who was largely erased from Leo's life following a high-conflict divorce in 2012. The filmmaker captures the potential outcomes of a child raised on a singular narrative. For 20 years, Leo was told his father was disinterested and unreliable. But as the documentary progresses, Leo watches court-ordered visitation footage, much like the supervised center footage we discussed in Part 6, and sees a man desperately trying to connect with a toddler through a plexiglass window. The film portrays the moment of cognitive dissonance. The image of the villain portrayed by the family narrative versus the reality of the man in the video. This is a recurring theme in 2026 documentaries, focusing on the reclamation of the father figure by the child. Historical trends analyzed in these legacy documentaries suggest a massive shift in how young American men view the institution of marriage and the legal system. Data from the 2026 U.S. Census Bureau indicates that marriage rates among men aged 20 to 30 have reached an all-time low, a phenomenon filmmakers are calling the marriage strike. Documentaries like The Opt-Out Generation provide a meticulous breakdown of why this trend exists. Through a series of case studies, the film shows that young men like Leo, having witnessed the financial and emotional liquidation of their own fathers, are increasingly viewing legal marriage as a high-risk contract with no upside. The documentary portrays these men not as anti-commitment, but as legally risk-averse. They are shown opting for cohabitation agreements and private partnership contracts that bypass the state-controlled family court system entirely. The filmmaker uses this data to argue that the portrayal of divorced men as victims in previous decades has directly influenced the demographic collapse of the traditional nuclear family today. Step by step, these films explore the rise of the reconciliation documentary. This is a new genre where adult children use investigative journalism techniques to find their erased fathers. The value of these films lies in their ability to show the long-term impact of parental alienation from the victim's perspective, the child. We see Leo tracking down Marcus, who is now living in a small town in New Mexico. The camera captures the raw, unscripted moment of their first meeting in 15 years. The documentary highlights the potential outcomes of this reunion. The discovery of years of undelivered letters, the realization of shared interests, and the shared grief over lost time. The filmmaker uses this personal story to critique the historical trend of the better safe than sorry judicial policy, showing that the safety the court thought it was providing actually resulted in a 2-decade-long psychological trauma for the child. Furthermore, we must examine the emergence of child-led advocacy groups that are now producing their own documentary content. In 2026, organizations like the Children's Rights Council are using short-form documentary series to lobby for legislative change. They focus on the concept of loss of parental consortium, a legal term usually reserved for wrongful death cases, which these advocates are now applying to family court interventions. The documentary shows adult children testifying that the state's decision to limit their time with their fathers was a violation of their own civil rights. This is a sophisticated narrative shift. It moves the conversation away from father's rights and toward the child's right to be parented. The film portrays the divorced man not as a complainant, but as a secondary victim of a system that infringed upon the child's fundamental needs. To add more depth, let us look at how these documentaries portray the intersection of mental health and the next generation. Psychologists interviewed in 2026 legacy films discuss the concept of intergenerational litigation trauma. They argue that children who grow up watching their fathers being treated as suspects by the state develop a profound distrust of all legal and governmental institutions. The documentary uses case studies of young adults who struggle with authority, showing how their childhood experiences at the hands of gals and judges have shaped their worldviews. The filmmaker illustrates this through Leo's story, showing his hesitation to engage in any civic process that reminds him of the courtroom. This is portrayed as the invisible cost of the divorce industry, the erosion of social trust in a generation of American citizens. The value of these films also extends to the financial analysis of the legacy. Modern documentaries are beginning to track the intergenerational wealth gap caused by the financial shredder of the 2010s. They show how the liquidation of a father's assets often meant that the children, like Leo, grew up without the college funds or inheritance that would have provided them with a head start in life. The film uses data to show that the $50 billion divorce industry didn't just take money from the fathers, it effectively taxed the future of the children. This adds a layer of economic critique that resonates with the 2026 audience, framing the legal system as a predator on the American middle class. As the documentary follows Leo and Marcus's attempts to rebuild their relationship, it also highlights the role of modern technology in reconciliation. The filmmaker shows how social media, genealogy sites, and digital archives have made it nearly impossible for a parent to be permanently erased in the digital age. The potential outcomes of this transparency are profound. The film suggests that the era of the secret divorce or the disappearing dad is over. In 2026, every legal filing, every social media post, and every digital footprint is a breadcrumb that the next generation will eventually follow. The documentary portrays this as a form of digital justice, where the truth eventually catches up to the court-ordered narrative. But as Leo and Marcus sit together in the final scenes of the film, there is a lingering sense of the unfixable. The documentary does not offer a Hollywood ending. Instead, it shows two men trying to learn how to be father and son while skipping 20 years of history. The filmmaker uses a wide-angle shot of the New Mexico desert to emphasize the vastness of what was lost. The legacy of the portrayal of divorced men in America is not just a collection of films. It is a landscape of fractured identities and hard-won truths. The documentary record has documented the destruction, the resistance, and the mental collapse. Now, it is documenting the messy and imperfect process of putting the pieces back together. This leads us to the final, most critical question of this 10-part masterclass. We have seen the system, the allegations, the financial ruin, the psychological erasure, and the legacy of the next generation. We have analyzed how the camera has both demonized and humanized these men. But as we stand in 2026, where do we go from here? Is the American documentary record merely a mirror reflecting our failures? Or is it a blueprint for a different kind of future? In the final part of this deep dive, we will look at the global context. We will compare the U.S. experience with international historical trends in Scandinavia and Europe, where the portrayal of the divorced man is radically different. We will explore the potential outcomes of a society that chooses to view the father not as a problem to be managed, but as a foundation to be protected. The journey ends where the new world begins. If you want to see what the end of the divorce industry actually looks like, you cannot miss the conclusion. The new world begins with a fundamental shift in the definition of the family unit under the law. And to see this future, we must look at the historical trends currently unfolding in the Nordic regions. In countries like Sweden and Denmark, the high-conflict divorce documentary as we know it in the United States simply does not exist. While American filmmakers are busy documenting the destruction of men like James and Brian, Nordic media is focused on the logistics of collaboration. To understand the potential outcomes for the United States in 2026 and beyond, we must perform a comparative analysis of these two vastly different realities. In the United States, the system is adversarial by design. It is a zero-sum game where one parent must be labeled the primary and the other the visitor. In Scandinavia, the system is administrative. There is a rebuttable presumption of 50-50 shared parenting that is so deeply ingrained in the social fabric that it is rarely even litigated. Imagine a man named Anders, a 39-year-old architect in Stockholm. In a 2026 documentary exploring global family structures, Anders is portrayed not as a litigant, but as a co-parent. When Anders and his partner decided to separate, there was no emergency restraining order, no forensic audit of his life savings, and no silver bullet allegation. The documentary follows Anders as he uses a state-mandated digital platform to coordinate schedules with his children's mother. The filmmaker uses bright, natural lighting and open spaces to contrast the sterile, claustrophobic courtrooms of the American documentary record. This is the first step in dismantling the divorce industry, removing the profit incentive for conflict. In Anders's world, there are no $50,000 legal bills because there is nothing to fight over. The law has already decided that he is a foundation of his children's lives, not a problem to be managed. The potential outcomes of this model are staggering when viewed through the lens of data. Historical trends in countries with presumptive shared parenting show significantly lower rates of paternal suicide, lower rates of child poverty, and a near disappearance of the parental alienation phenomenon we analyzed in Part 6. Why? Because you cannot easily erase a parent who is legally and socially mandated to be present half the time. The documentary filmmaker illustrates this by showing Anders at a routine school meeting. He is not a guest. He is a permanent fixture. The value of this comparative analysis for a U.S. audience is that it proves the American tragedy is not a natural byproduct of human nature, but a specific result of a specific legal architecture. Step by step, these international documentaries show how the removal of Title 4D-style incentives changes the behavior of the state. In the Nordic model, the state does not profit from the collection of child support in the same way the U.S. system does. Instead, the focus is on ensuring both parents remain economically viable. We see Anders maintaining his professional trajectory because his financial obligations are balanced and predictable. He is not being liquidated, he is being supported. This is the blueprint for the end of the U.S. divorce industry. It requires a radical transparency that U.S. documentaries are only just beginning to demand. Now, let us imagine if this model were fully implemented in the United States by 2026. We would see a new genre of documentary, the restoration. In this vision, we follow a man named David, whom we met in Part 3, but in an alternate reality where the Parental Equality Act has been passed. In this version of the story, David does not spend 3 years in a cattle call courtroom. Instead, he spends those 3 years being a father. The documentary portrays the potential outcomes of a society that protects the father-child bond as a fundamental civil right. We see the data-driven results. David's stress levels are lower, his productivity is higher, and his children show none of the signs of the loyalty binds that decimated Leo's childhood in Part 9. The filmmaker uses this case study to show that when you protect the father, you protect the child. To add more depth to this masterclass, we must examine the economic pivot that occurs when the $50 billion divorce industry is dismantled. Documentaries in 2026 are beginning to track where that money goes when it is no longer being funneled into the pockets of high-conflict litigators. We see that money being reinvested into the children's college funds, into family homes, and into the mental health of the parents. This is portrayed as a massive grassroots stimulus package for the American middle class. The filmmaker uses infographics to show the shift from a conflict-based economy to a stability-based economy. This is the value proposition of reform. It isn't just about fairness for men. It is about the economic survival of the American family. The final synthesis of the U.S. documentary Record on Divorced Men reveals a culture at a crossroads. We have spent 10 parts deconstructing the portrayal of men as villains, victims, cash cows, and ghosts. We have seen how the camera captures the moment of the breaking point and the slow climb toward activism. But the ultimate lesson of these films is that the portrayal of the divorced man is actually a mirror of our own societal values. If we portray him as a threat, we build a system that treats him like one. If we portray him as an essential foundation, we build a system that preserves him. Case studies of the most successful 2026 documentaries show that they all end with a call for cultural surgery. This is the process of cutting away the outdated archetypes that have governed our media for 50 years. The films argue that we must stop viewing divorce as a war and start viewing it as a transition. They use the stories of men like Michael, Robert, and Thomas to show that while the marriage may end, the family does not. The documentary lens is finally moving toward a holistic view of the male identity, one that encompasses his role as a provider, a protector, and most importantly, a present and loving parent. The legacy of this 10-part deep dive is a framework for understanding the most significant social shift of our time. We have moved from the sensationalist exposés of the 1990s to the sophisticated, data-driven advocacy of the 2020s. We have seen the potential outcomes of a system left unchecked and the historical trends of a movement that refuses to be silenced. The American divorced man is no longer a silent statistic. He is a vocal advocate, a resilient survivor, and the protagonist of a new kind of American story. As the credits roll on this masterclass, we are left with a final open loop. While we have mapped the history and the current state of these portrayals, the future is still being filmed. The reforms we have discussed are being debated in state houses across the country at this very moment. The children of the divorce industry are growing up and taking their places in the voting booths. The final question is not whether the system will change, but whether you are prepared for the world that comes after the gavel stops falling. If the divorce industry ends today, what kind of father, what kind of man, and what kind of society will we choose to be tomorrow? The cameras are still rolling, and the most important part of the story is the one you are about to write. But as one industry collapses, another is rising from the ashes, one that doesn't rely on courtrooms, but on the very technology that was once used to track us. In our next series, we will dive into the portrayal of the digital father and the rise of the algorithmic family. You thought the legal system was powerful. Wait until you see how the Silicon Valley of 2026 is redefining what it means to be a parent.